I see, I know.
All right, let's get started. Good afternoon. I hope you had a good weekend and enjoyed the snow/hailstorms and all that fun stuff that we had. I was up at Walla Walla for the weekend, and like as soon as we got back, got hit by a wave of snow. So we made it back this time and realized that we're probably not going anywhere anytime soon. So welcome back. Glad to have everybody here. We're approaching the third week, which means we have another wave of theories to talk about. We spent some time last Friday talking about signups for the theory presentation. So I know there were a number of folks who were not able to come last Friday. I submitted a form for campus announcements. You should be able to access that form if you haven't done so already. I'll also repost that form for you after class. The Google form just asks you to indicate any preferences that you have about a date to do your presentation, or any times you can indicate to me that you're not able to present. Please get that to me by the end of the day. That way, going into Wednesday's class, we have the signups and all of that ready to go. We'll not start any of the presentations until next week or later. That way, you have plenty of time to work through and start to develop that. Again, if there are theories that especially jump out to you as interesting that you'd like to talk about, you're welcome to indicate those preferences. Or if you don't care and you're available at any time, then that's okay too. We spent time last class talking about social exchange theory, or SET. And this is a framework that thinks about our human relationships in very monetary terms, right? That in SET, we are making strategic decisions about the overall work, considering the costs and benefits of relationships in our own lives. So as a review, let's see who can get this one correct first. Jessica, what is your answer here?
According to SET, behavior control.
Yes.
Involves impacting our own outcomes to affect relationships.
Correct. So behavior control, right, means that we might modify or alter the way that we act around other people to get them to behave differently or to change the overall work of the relationship. For instance, maybe you're talking to somebody that you're just getting to know as friends, and you choose to share a very unique and personal thing about your own family background. And in doing so, you hope that your relationship will be stronger with them because they'll disclose and share more too. So this idea here is that we're not just making this hard decision about values, but we are trying to figure out what we can do to change a relationship that isn't working before we abandon relationships altogether. So SET is a useful framework for thinking about our relationships. For today, I want to talk a little bit more about the presentation assignment. Later today, I'll be posting the full rubric so that you know what to expect there. And then we'll also be talking about social penetration theory and applying SPT to everyday life. This is another theory that's very interpersonal focused, so our one-on-one communication. Later this week, we'll be starting to move toward more mediated and group-oriented theories. So this might be a theory that's somewhat familiar to you if you've taken a class like interpersonal communication before. So for the presentation, again, in addition to that form, I will be posting the rubric. Again, the rubric has a grid of the expectations. For this assignment, I'm grading it based on a few factors. One of them is an outline. I'm asking you to turn in a 1 to 2 page outline at least a day before your presentation that goes over the main points that you'll be covering. Think about the outline as something that you could print out or even have on your phone or other device for yourself as you're working through. The purpose of a presentation outline is to highlight the key points and ideas that you'd be covering in your presentation. So it's not necessarily like a word for word script, but it's a way to jog your memory and think, okay, what did I want to talk about next? Oh yeah, it's right here in the outline. The presentations, right, I'm looking at the degree to which you are integrating a creative, your own approach toward understanding or addressing the theory. I'm not looking for like a laundry list explanation of the theory or the parts of the theory. Just to show you again, in terms of the expectations here that I'm looking for your presentation, it's listed here on the syllabus, and also the presentation has been posted as an assignment to Canvas. The class presentation is 4 to 6 minutes. So 6 minutes is the hard cap. I'll use time signals to let you know how much time we have left. The prompt is, why does this theory matter to our lives? So however you choose to answer that question, whether it's ways that it feels personally relevant to you or ways you can show why we should care, you can choose to answer that question. But incorporate things such as examples from the world, personal examples, etc. And again, I'm asking for that outline that covers the content you'll be going over in the presentation. In addition to that, I wanted to remind you that there is the annotated bibliography assignment that is due this Sunday on Canvas. Again, I'm asking you to identify at least 3 outside sources that have talked about or used your theory. The purpose of this assignment is to help you to explore how these theories are relevant, are used, and are talked about, right? If you think about this class is kind of being like looking at a car and understanding how a car gets made, like the core authors and ideas behind the theory, this assignment lets you see how that car has been driven around and used. So again, you can use that rubric. If you send me an outline or draft by Friday, I would be able to return feedback to you, let you know the score that you can expect to receive. So let me know today, as soon as possible, if you do need an extension on this assignment. For instance, you've got a lot of things coming up and you know that you need extra time. I just ask that you let me know when you would intend to turn it in if you do think that you need extra time to complete this. It's not a formal paragraph essay structure. It's just, here's the source, here's an annotation or paragraph describing this article and its relevance to the course. One other note that I wanted to give before we dive into the new stuff for today, I had a note from a couple people who might be using an older edition of the textbook. For instance, if you got the 4th edition from the bookstore rather than the 7th edition, the content of the chapters is what you need and is completely fine for the course. But if you're using an older edition, you should just take the time to double check the chapter numbers. The chapter numbers that are listed here are the ones that correspond to the 7th edition. So if you're using an older edition, what I would recommend that you do is don't look at the chapter numbers, look at the theories that are listed. For instance, social exchange theory might be listed as chapter 7 or 8 in an older edition. So just make sure to find the chapter that corresponds to the theory that's listed for the class. So as long as you've read the chapters that correspond to the theories that we talked about for that week, using an older edition has like a slightly different chapter list is completely fine. So I know some people have been using older editions. I want to help you out if you're using an older edition and are running into any issues there. And if you're still running into issues like you're not able to access some of the content that you need, let me know, and I'm happy to help you work through that or get you access to the version that you need. Any questions about the annotated bibliography, anything in the class at this stage before we get started? Great. Questions do come up at any point, let me know. So I mentioned that we use a lot of examples, whether they're examples from film, TV shows, reality TV. As a kind of sillier example, I was mentioning before the film Shrek and the metaphor of the onion that's described in that movie, which I thought would be a memorable way to think about social penetration theory for today. So again, it's kind of a silly example, but I think does a good job of identifying this theory and why this theory matters to our lives. The core idea here of today's theory is the idea that our relationships move in this spectrum from more detached and disconnected from one another to deeper, more intimate, and more closely connected. And there's a lot of different elements of how we choose to bring relationships among people closer to one another. But a really core element of how those relationships become closer or more distant is through the process of self-disclosure, right? Self-disclosure is a way in which we convey our comfort. It's also a way that we understand and move past the basic information about other people. For instance, some of us might find ourselves in relationships that feel really superficial. Maybe there's a teammate, coworker, or somebody that we know with whom our relationships are, very basic. How are you? Oh, I'm good. How are you? And doesn't really get at a lot of those core aspects of ourselves. And we've talked a lot about how reciprocity, according to other theories in the course, such as uncertainty reduction theory, impacts that process too, right? That oftentimes if we're less comfortable, we're going to be more withdrawn too. So this is a theory that really closely connects with the theories we've talked about so far in the class. Again, it's socio-psychological, looking at our relationships and our human cognition that guides our social behavior. It is interpersonal and looking between two people, not intrapersonal this time though, because social penetration theory doesn't really work about your level of disclosure with yourself. And it, again, is positivistic and empirical, using a sort of mathematical or quantitative approach to measure how we look at our comfort with others. So this theory comes from Altman and Taylor, who are both socio-psychologists and interested in understanding what guides our human cognition and how we approach issues that we might feel anxiety or uncertainty toward. So if you're kind of looking back through your notes and reflecting on this, you can think about this as the onion theory, right? Social penetration theory is getting at the various layers that we express ourselves to other people. Core idea here is pretty straightforward. As relationships develop with other people, they become more intimate and connected. That the more time that we spend with people and the greater comfort that we feel, the more we peel back the layers of the onion and choose to share details about our lives that are more important to us. If we think about what the core is of our essence as human beings, that's at the core of our self-disclosure and relationships. For instance, our hopes, our dreams, our aspirations, the stories we tell ourselves, the views that are really important to us might be lying in at the corner of how we choose to share and talk to other people. For example, right, oftentimes we find ourselves a little bit embarrassed or uncertain about sharing really core elements of our identity because we don't really feel comfortable talking about them to people we don't know. Maybe we think it's a little bit hokey or cringe to share things that are important to us about us. So we like the idea of building trust and feeling like those things aren't going to be a subject of teasing from somebody else or used against us. We also use our connection, right, to make sense of the status of our relationship with other people. So oftentimes we're trying to figure out what the appropriate level of disclosure is and look at cues from other people to make that decision. For instance, if somebody chooses to start to share and tell a little bit about their family, you might choose to do so as well to reciprocally meet that person and the level that you see yourself reaching in that relationship. And this theory helps us to understand how we can create good relationships by helping us to look at the different layers of ourselves and how we choose to share this. So again, each of the theories in the class has a set of assumptions. One of the assumptions, as we've talked about, is the idea that relationships move on this spectrum from not very intimate, things like a casual acquaintance, somebody that you don't know very well and talk to at a very impersonal level, to a really close friend, family member, partner, and so on, that you talk to very regularly or at a much deeper level. One of the core ideas and the reason why this is a more positivistic or empirical theory, right, a science-driven theory, is that it suggests and predictable, that we can measure and analyze how our relationships can develop and change with other people. For folks who have sort of critiqued the binary approach to thinking about relationships, right, that's a concern that Logan brought up last class about social exchange theory. That applies here too, right? The spectrum of more or less disclosure with a person can definitely change depending on the situation or context. One of the later theories we'll get at the class, called face negotiation theory, offers a bit of a critique of this too. And this idea here of the importance of self-disclosure and how our relationships develop is crucial. So in thinking about social penetration theory, a good kind of visual way of thinking about these different layers of the onion is related to the topics or issues that are present in these different layers, right? So we have what are known as the peripheral layers, the intermediate layers, and the central layers. And depending on how we choose to interact with people, we might show more or fewer of those layers. At a peripheral level, you can think about what you're oftentimes sharing in an introduction, like for class, where you're sharing things like your major, your hometown. Maybe you're sharing age. For some, age might be in the more intermediate level because it's something that you're not as comfortable sharing casually. But those kind of basic pieces of demographic information are considered to be very safe, right? They're oftentimes things that people could gather about you if they did something like a quick internet search or had a very basic conversation with you. They're oftentimes good conversation starters. They're ways to find points of commonality with other people, and they generally feel low risk. At the intermediate level, right, is when you start to see your sort of opinions and identity and perspective on life develop, right? One way of thinking about the intermediate layers in practice is that it's when you're starting to show elements of yourself that other people might not find as very similar to you. For instance, things such as musical tastes, political beliefs, maybe religious or spiritual beliefs, your interests and activities, hobbies, things that you like to do, right? Those things that start to get at who you are as a person and what your perspective on life looks like can be a very make or break moment, because for people that are similar to you, you might find that there's a lot you have to share and talk about, but you might also notice that there's a lot of relational distance that can develop at that stage too. Not to say you have to be exactly like somebody else. There's definitely ways that despite a lot of differences in interests, that you can still have close relationships. And then in the central layer, this gets at much of the core of who you are as a person, right? This gets at things such as your fears, your values, what you see as core elements of your personality and traits. For instance, one thing that oftentimes comes up in the context of romantic relationships is whether or not people in a relationship are interested in marriage or children. How do they want to approach that relationship? What are the values? Do they want a big or a small wedding or no wedding at all, right? Those are things that might be found within those central layers because it's at the core of what you might want as a person. Self-awareness, self-concept, and self-esteem are all really kind of core elements of how we choose to present ourselves to other people, right? Self-esteem is a value judgment on how we see ourselves. So for instance, if you feel like you don't like your body, you don't like how you look, you might choose to more openly share that at a more central layer. I don't like the way that my eyes look or my eyelashes look, right? Self-concept refers to a sort of stable way that you view yourself as a person. So it could be your personality traits, but it could also be what you see as some of your flaws or issues or things that you need to keep working on as a person. And self-awareness, right? What you know about yourself to be true. So for instance, you say, I worry about being somebody that's always late and never able to be counted on by others. And you choose to disclose that fear that you have at that central layer, right? So again, these different layers correspond to things that are in this sort of hidden quadrant. Think back to the Johari window. Things you know about yourself, but things that you might not choose to share to other people, depending on the circumstance. When we think about relational development and how this theory helps to explain our social relationships, there's a few ideas that are really important here. One of the ideas here is that this notion of intimacy, right, is not just about physical involvement with somebody else. It's not just in a romantic or sexual context, although that's oftentimes how we think about intimacy. But intimacy is also a question of emotions, right? And our intellectual engagement with other people too. That somebody could be involved in like a friend relationship, it could be incredibly close and involve deep emotional attachment that's rooted in things such as shared interests and the ability to share some of these central layers of somebody's identity. Additionally, this idea of social penetration and of the different layers of self and of identity is not just about the verbal communication that we do, right? It's not just about what you choose to say to another person, but it also includes nonverbal and environmental components as well. Again, the study of interpersonal communication, many scholars suggest that up to 85% of our communication between two people face-to-face is nonverbal. We tend to attribute more credibility to our nonverbal communication. If somebody says they're happy to see you, but they're sounding sarcastic in their tone, they're rolling their eyes, or they're looking at their phone, we're more likely to interpret them as not being happy to see us, and instead trusting their actions louder than their words, right? So nonverbal communication not only involves things such as tone of voice, it can also involve the use of proxemics, use of physical proximity, how close you're standing to somebody else, haptics, or your use of touch. Are you tapping somebody on the shoulder? For instance, right? Sometimes, depending on the culture, the use of physical touch in a non-romantic context is considered more or less appropriate. For instance, in relationships between men, in a lot of nations in Western Europe, it's common to do things such as put your arms over your shoulder or hold hands in a way that's not interpreted as romantic or sexual. In the United States, that's much more likely to be coded as a romantic or sexual relationship. So those elements are important too. We tend to open up, as uncertainty reduction theory tells us, the way that we share ourselves non-verbally with people over time. And then lastly, this idea of environmental components matters a lot too. It's not just that we communicate with other people. It's also a question of where and how we communicate. If we think back to last week and the examples of things such as catfishing, one of the ways to break some of those peripheral layers was to actually meet somebody for the first time, face to face, to go to their house and figure out if they were who they said they were, right? So environment, physically going and meeting, moving from a virtual to a face-to-face space is one way to do that. It also might involve choosing to share things that are important to you. For instance, if you have started dating somebody and you introduce them to your friends, or if you've watched like so many examples of holiday romantic comedies where there's a couple and they go and visit parents for the first time, right? The use of environment, including physical environment, is a component of self-disclosure. It's not just what you choose to share about yourself. It's also how you choose to share your environment and the locations that are important to you as well. There's also this idea that while it is a spectrum, right, you're not just moving in a single direction over this theory, that our relationships can also involve sort of moving backwards, right, deep penetration or dissolution. That is, there are times in which relationships can definitely drift apart or change depending on things like major differences. Again, you might have had a relationship that you were really close with in the past, but maybe you and somebody that you knew from grade school has gone in a really different direction because you and that person have started to have very different views, maybe in terms of social, political, and other ideas, or maybe, their network, friendships, hobbies, and activities are just incredibly different from yours. So developing difference is one example. This happens especially as we approach relationships that we were involved in since teenagers, because when we're at a more formative stage, we oftentimes can develop into very different people. So that can be one example of moving backwards or moving apart. Time can also be moving apart too. That there are just friendships and relationships, including in the context of COVID-19, where we just have not had those relationships develop in the same way, and we've drifted apart. There are what's known as transgressions, right? Transgression is what's considered to be a violation of the rules or norms. One theory that we're not getting to at this point is known as expectancy violations theory. It's a question of what do we do when somebody acts outside of what we consider to be appropriate behavior in the relationship. But sometimes we'll also use a transgression to test the comfort or test the waters of a relationship. For instance, if somebody chooses to share a very personal detail or risk oversharing, they might do so in an effort to make the relationship develop. It doesn't feel like it's quite there. And also, right, there's this idea that relationships can have what are known as both depth and breadth. Depth being how far into a topic or issue you can get. Breadth being the range of topics or issues that you can explore with that relationship. For instance, there might be a friendship with whom you can easily get along with the person, and you can do all sorts of things with the friend. For instance, you could go on a hike, or you could cook together, or you could study together. It's somebody that's generally up for anything. That would be good breadth. Good depth would mean that you could really get into and explore an activity or issue with a person. For instance, maybe you are friends with an avid hiker who does a lot of really long backpacking trips that's into that. So the way that our relationships develop is through a combination of these two elements. So as we've talked about with social exchange theory, right, our relationships are oftentimes considered when we think about costs or benefits that we associate with them. Again, this can be a weird measurement because sometimes we don't see our relationships in these kinds of ways, but there is this idea that in general, there's something that we find meaningful or important to us in a relationship that makes that relationship worthwhile to us or to that other person. So in the same way, right, you're assessing some of the risks of choosing to disclose and move past those peripheral layers. To get to a point that was raised last week, sometimes there are strangers that we're not really interested in getting to know that much better, right? We are comfortable maintaining difference and distance because moving in closer doesn't really impact our relationship on the whole. But we also know that choosing to share more intimate or personal details with somebody else is an issue that brings risk, that sometimes it's not going to be reciprocated and somebody has information about us they might choose to use. Again, if you think back to self-disclosure in something like middle school or junior high, oftentimes people would use rumors and gossip and share information with each other that was meant to be in private. And that risks in sharing and self-disclosing mean what will that other person evaluate or judge that we've chosen to share. For instance, you find that your perspective on a spiritual or religious issue is very different than somebody else, and it's really challenging to communicate with that person. You're kind of at this weird standstill where it's like, well, what do we do now? So those are things to consider. We also have to think about things such as culture, right? We'll look at more culturally oriented theories. Culture refers, of course, to a set of views and experiences that define us, oftentimes in a generational way. And culture oftentimes means that what we choose to share and our level of comfort in sharing information could look different. In some cultures, for instance, there's a lot more power distance, and so a supervisor is less willing to share and have a good relationship with an employee. It's strictly business. So what barriers might be in place that impact what is chosen to be shared could be really different too. So as we've talked about, there are different layers of yourself that you might share, but there are also different stages of social penetration that help us to explain and understand relational development. The first stage would be orientation, where we are sizing up and trying to figure out the basics of a relationship. So for instance, as we've talked about sharing information about your hobbies, interests, activities, a lot of that really straightforward information. In an exploratory affective stage, that means that you and that other person are starting to develop a personality or approach to your relationship. Maybe, for instance, this is somebody that you talk to every day when you're going into a chemistry class together, and you choose to share and exchange notes. So at this stage, you're starting to develop a dynamic with that other person. In an affective exchange, that means that generally speaking, you're less guarded, right? You're choosing to just kind of share whatever comes to mind, and you feel more comfortable just talking about whatever topics you and that other person might see as relevant to yourself, right? You could think about social penetration theory as a question of how much we choose to self-censor and withhold from our conversations with others. And then finally, we move to a stable exchange, where we choose to share in complete openness with other people, topics and issues that matter and are really important to us. We'll move from those different stages in sharing our relationships. So this theory, social penetration theory, is widely used. Again, if you've taken a class like communication, you've probably run into this theory before. I think it's a pretty simple and straightforward one that explains a lot about how our relationships develop and how we choose to share comfort in our relationships. But one critique is that this idea of self-disclosure is a too narrow way of thinking about our relationships and development. As I mentioned, a lot of these theories have been developed decades ago, and while many of them are still relevant to thinking about things like social media and technology, it's definitely changed the landscape. That self-disclosure is not necessarily the way that we move from the peripheral to the intermediate levels, especially when we have access to technology. When people, for instance, are going on dates with each other and choose to stalk their social media accounts, right? Or the idea, right, of doxing, or a behavior in which somebody's address and personal information is publicly revealed, oftentimes as an act of like blackmail or retaliation, are examples of the ways in which self-disclosure in a mediated environment is not always something that we're comfortable with. For instance, you might be familiar with the phrase, nothing ever gets deleted from the internet. What people might choose to share and exchange on the internet or post, right, can oftentimes pop up later. And so self-disclosure in an era in which we find ourselves sharing information online can be a lot more challenging. One critique, again, is this critique of the binary or spectrum approach to relationships. That relationships are not necessarily linear. It's not just that you're more or less comfortable, you're all of yourself, you're none of yourself, you're somewhere in between, but that the idea that relationships bring different parts out of us. That maybe we have a relationship with whom we can connect on a lot of political and social topics, like we talked a lot about the issues of the day and current events and news, but we come from really different environments in terms of our hobbies and interests. We have the things in common, but we also have a lot of differences. And maybe in another relationship with like a family member, we have a lot of hobbies and ideas that we share a lot in common in, but we find it really difficult to share our beliefs on other issues. To give you one example, many members of my extended family have very kind of different, very diametrically opposed political opinions. They found it hard to communicate and have a good relationship over the last couple of years, knowing that a lot of those topics are on the surface. But a lot of people in my extended family love dogs. And so one of the easiest things that they gravitate to is just talking about the dogs and talking about how silly the dogs and their families are, right? And examples like that show us some of the ways that we manage relationships and try to maintain closeness and interest, even as we're navigating differences. And also, right, there's this idea that relationships are not necessarily defined the same way by everybody. That what we see as a close relationship with one person might be a little bit one-sided, and the other person in the relationship does not see the relationship as quite as close, or sees what they think of as a best or close friend as more of a casual acquaintance. So definitely when we're thinking about culture and the potential to misrepresent or misunderstand a relationship, that plays a role too. So again, I think that the example of Shrek is a silly one. I'm going to show you the Onion clip if you haven't already seen the film, right? But the sort of memed to that film, right, is an example where he's an ogre, right? That he's tired of feeling like he's treated negatively or poorly on the basis of things like his appearance. And in this example, right, he's comparing himself to an onion, saying that he has layers, helping us to think about how physical appearance is oftentimes a periphery or outer layer, and that our ability to self-disclose and share more detailed or personal information about ourselves is something that we oftentimes seek in our social relationships. I also find it interesting, as you'll kind of see here, that he is frustrated about feeling like he is not being understood as he's choosing to share this metaphor of his relationships.
Okay, you're gonna go fight a dragon and rescue a princess just so Farquaad to get you back to the swamp, which you only don't have because you filled it full of freaks in the first place. Is that about right?
You know what? Maybe there's a good reason don't
he shouldn't talk.
I don't get it, Shrek. Why don't you just pull some of that ogre stuff on him? You know, lay siege to his fortress. Grant his bones to make it bread. You know the whole ogre trick.
Oh, I know what. Maybe I could have decapitated an entire village and put their heads on a plate, got a knife, cut open their spleen and drink their fluids. Does that sound good to you?
No, not really, no.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
Example?
Example. Okay, ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white heads.
No. Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
Oh, you both have layers. Oh. You know, not everybody likes onions. Cake! Everybody loves cake. Cake have layers. I don't care.
So kind of silly, right? But I think it's an interesting, albeit somewhat heavy-handed way of thinking about this series because not only is there this, I'm not, this scary evil creature. There's more about me. There's frustration with trying to share and have other people understand. In this case, Donkey doesn't get right that he's like an onion because he has layers. And also, I think it's kind of interesting that Donkey says toward the end, well, not everybody likes onions, right? So there's concern we feel that as we choose to share and disclose who we are to other people, that the version of ourselves that we share might not be something that other people like. So again, getting at self-disclosure and some of the challenges that we navigate when we choose to share things about who we are and dispel some of the assumptions that people might have about us. So what I want you to do now is to take some time on your own to write or type, and you can include your name on this. And I'd like you to kind of diagram out, use little circles for yourself to draw if you'd like, what the different layers might look like to you. So you don't necessarily need to share or write down things if you'd rather have me not see, but you can share either like the categories or if there's anything specific that you'd like to identify as what you would place in a more peripheral layer, what you would place in more of an intermediate layer, and what you would put in more of a central layer. So you might think about this as what are the categories or types of information that you choose to share in more of your superficial or basic relationships? What are the things that you share in your kind of intermediate relationships with people you know fairly well, but you're not best friends with? And what are the things that you choose to share in relationships with whom you share a lot in common? So I'll give you some time to think about and draw out what those different layers might look like.
And can you explain the bottom ones again? The central layer?
Yeah, so the central layer would be much more about the core of who you are as a person. It might involve things such as how you value yourself, like self-esteem. Am I a good or a bad person? It might be the sort of stable beliefs that you have about yourself, like your personality traits, some of your core strengths and weaknesses as a person, things about yourself that you would only really share with people that you were really comfortable with.
What if you're just too comfortable with everything? Huh? Yeah, I don't share everything.
Once you feel good about what you've sort of corresponded to layers for yourself, the next step that I want you to think about would be to approach some of the relationships in your life and to think about which relationship which relationship corresponds to which layer, right? So for instance, you might think about a friend that you're pretty close to, you've talked to for a few months, that knows through EOU. You might put it at an intermediate level. You might have a close family member or friend that's in the central layer. So start to think about if you were to place people in those different layers, that would look like. And once you felt good about your diagram, both in terms of what you fit into your different layers and also some of the people that you've slotted into some of those layers, I'd like you to find somebody else in the class. You can also form a group of 3 and just compare some notes. What do you notice as similar or different in the process of coming up with your own onion? And what did each of you discover in that partnership or group through that process of developing your diagram? So once you've wrapped up for yourself, take a little bit of time to share what you worked on with somebody else.
Wow.
Know them from and then centralized like best friend.
Maybe a couple more minutes to share. Go ahead and finish up your conversation. All right. So in kind of hovering and hearing some of you share, a couple of things that stood out to me. One is circumstances that might bring us together. For instance, if we're roommates, right, or family, we have physical proximity. We're oftentimes forced to share or get closer with somebody else and have a lot more opportunities to do so. Another thing that stood out was some of the ways you might choose to share information. For instance, some of basic information about yourself, family information, your comfort with interactions, pronouns, other types of things that allow you to develop a little bit of a closer relationship later because you've established groundwork, and also finding shared activities and interests, and at times feeling like relationships can accelerate once you found those things in common that can implicate other aspects of your relationship too. So again, this is a way for us to think about and share ways that we disclose and build our relationship. So just as a reminder, please complete that Google form if you haven't done so already for the presentation for today. We talked about SPT, the idea that social penetration theory discusses why we choose to disclose or share who we are to other people, and our levels of comfort and willingness to do so. So for next class, on Wednesday, we will look at social information processing theory. We'll start to look at some of the mediated and other ways that our relationships begin to develop. Go ahead and pass forward or email to me your activity for today. Have a great rest of your Monday. Here's hoping all the snow is gone. But I look forward to seeing you soon.